My name is Kelly McKeon, and today is March 20th, 2015, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Norman Janes, who is one of Connecticut's legal aid pioneers. I am conducting this interview as part of the James W. Cooper's Fellows History of Legal Services in Connecticut project, and so why don't we just start off, Norm,
Good.
And you can just give us a little brief intro of when you started and how you started and where you started.
Okay, I started, and I don't remember exact dates on this, I'm sorry to say, but
Rough timeline.
right. Sometime in 1967, when I was still in law school, made a connection with a fellow named Bruce Burwald, who was had just recently been named the executive director of the Tolland Wyndham Legal Assistance Program in Willimantic.
And we actually interviewed Bruce as well.
Bruce is one of the interviews we've done, exactly. At any rate, I had a connection with him and came out to Willimantic, which was actually near where I had grown up. So I was familiar with the area and did some traditional law school kind of internship with him. When I graduated in '68, Bruce was more than happy to hire me, except that I had to find my own funds. I was a VISTA volunteer, volunteer in service to America. And I think that I earned $4,000 a year. My wife earned, or maybe it was the combination, we earned $4,000. I can't remember. It was very little money that we were VISTA volunteers, sort of, and that was part of the idea. Anyway, so I got hired and started in '68 when I was graduated from law school. Worked there in 1971. My wife and I left the state and went to Maryland for a few years to teach at a Quaker boarding school, but that wasn't really my thing, and came back in a few years later because the then executive director of the Tolland Wyndham Legal Assistance Program, Doug Crockett, who we also have done an interview of, had gotten a grant from the Federal Administration on Aging to do some work developing a project for representing and serving the legal needs of poor elderly people. And this was before elder law was a very highly paid, very lucrative, and very effective form of law practice. We were really on the cutting edge of developing that. Anyway, he convinced me to come back to Connecticut and work on that project, and I did for a number of years. In 1977, Connecticut Legal Services was formed, a merger of a number of the existing legal aid agencies in the state. And I was Tolland Wyndham was part of that, and so I was part of that, and I was their first director of the Elderly Disabled Task Force. In 1980, I became the executive director of Connecticut Legal Services. And I held that position until 1995, the end of 1995, when I left there because we were in the process of creating statewide legal services, which is still exists, which is a telephone hotline, a different kind of model than the traditionally legal aid model. And we did that for lots of reasons that we can go into if they may become relevant. But I stayed there until 2008. When I made my first effort to retire. Actually, I went there and I worked for a year with the Connecticut Bar Association as their executive director, an interim position. And then I practiced law, had a contract with the state to do some juvenile court work for about 18 months, and then went back to the Bar Association for another stint, and finally gave that up altogether, and I've been retired ever since.
So how did you get involved in this project? The interviewing process
the oral history,
early legal aid.
Right, yeah. Well, I was 1967 was pretty early in the game. I wasn't the first one by any stretch of the imagination, but I was there in the beginning, and I knew that lots of us who were there doing the work then were getting a little old in the tooth, and I thought, this is the kind of thing that oral history really ought to help. We're not going to be able to tell the whole story, but really interesting people and interesting stories, and we want to be able to remember it. So that's
wonderful.
I thought about it and got a lot of support and help from the Bar Foundation, and here we are.
Great. So let's go back to that early years, the very earliest years. What was it like in the office? Who were your clients? What type of cases were you handling?
Yeah,
in the very beginning.
It was very different than it is today. I mean, number one, we really didn't know a lot of what we were doing, quite frankly. I mean, I'd been on, I was still a law student, and then I just graduated from law school. Bruce had been out of law school maybe 2 years ahead of me. And we had one other lawyer in the office. So three of us, all of us, very young, very inexperienced. And so we really sort of did whatever any client brought in, we would try and deal with it. No sense of priorities, no sense of trying to figure out what was the most important thing for the community and so on. It's just people came in told us about their legal problems, and we tried to figure out how we could fix them. Which meant that there were a lot of divorces. Because remember, in these days, the clients also didn't understand legal aid and what it could do. And they said, well, lawyers get involved in divorces and maybe housing law because they get an eviction notice. Those kinds of things, but a lot of the public benefits and the other kind education, those kinds of things, clients didn't know to come to us, and we had yet at the very beginning really hadn't built the connections with the community to be able to help them to understand that we could help with those things as well. So a lot of traditional sort of legal problems that we were involved in.
So how did you initially make those connections? Just open the doors,
I
or did
pretty
you?
much just opened the
Okay.
doors, yeah. Although there was actually the Tullen Wyndham Legal Assistance Program, TWLP we call ourselves, was actually part of the Community Action Program. Community action agencies were funded by principally federal dollars, and they had a number of different kind of what were called anti-poverty programs. And we were under their umbrella, and so we had the connection with them and their outreach workers and the kind of projects that they were doing. So we had some entree into the client community. And again, there were plenty of people who had family problems, or plenty of people actually consumer was another area that people sort of understood that a lawyer might help. So people did come in on those kinds of things. But again, it was, we didn't develop any specialties. I'm not even sure if I can remember how we did intake, other than I think people if they came in today, we'd do an intake and we'd figure out what we could do.
So how did you and Bruce split up? Who's doing what? Did you do more of divorces, or was it just
It was
sort of?
It was if there was any real. I do remember that I kind of developed some expertise, if you can call it that, in unemployment compensation. At least I seemed to do more of those hearings than Bruce did. But now after a period of time, we did begin to, as the program grew, there were more of us. You could begin to specialize a little bit. But in the earliest days, it was just whoever came in. And again, I don't remember how we even assigned cases. It just, we
Do you
had
have
just-
any interesting stories from those earliest days? Any clients that particularly stand out to you, or cases that you worked on that
Well,
stand
actually,
out?
we did. The interesting thing is that we did a lot of really, I think that it might be called significant litigation those days. We and the other legal aid programs in Connecticut and those across the country. There weren't that many in the 60s. But this was a time when we actually didn't do much litigation in state court. Divorces, yes. Housing, yes. But any affirmative litigation that we did was in federal court. Federal courts were much more receptive, and the state courts much less receptive to the kinds of causes that our clients had. But we did. We actually sued the Willimantic Police Department for some discrimination against Puerto Rican residents. Actually, we sued the town of Wyndham School Board as well for some disciplinary problems that they were having, again, primarily with the Puerto Rican kids. We sued, we were involved in some welfare cases. One of the interesting cases, the one that really, we actually filed a case in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Wow. What case was this?
The case was Latham versus Tynan. It involved financial responsibility in motor vehicle cases. In those days, this was before mandatory liability insurance. And of course, lots of our clients who were driving, and not that many clients had cars, but in eastern Connecticut, if you were trying to work at all, you needed a car. So it was an important problem for our clients. But what happened was, if there had been an accident of any kind, you either had to show your insurance, and if you didn't have insurance, you're required to post a bond in case you were ultimately found to be liable. Well, our clients couldn't afford to post bonds, which meant that their only choice then was to give up their license until the liability was resolved, which as you know, can take quite a bit of time. And that was a real hardship on clients, again, who were the working poor. We thought that was unfair and decided that it was a violation of the Constitution, both due process and equal protection, if I recall correctly. Anyway, we actually had several clients that we filed an action in federal court on, but before the cases got too far, they got mooted out. We were able to resolve, the liability issues for them. But finally, we had this fellow named Latham. As I recall, he had an accident in a parking lot of a grocery store. Just a little fender bender. I mean, we're not talking about huge accidents. And for whatever reason, we weren't able to resolve it. And so in those days, the federal district courts would have a 3-judge panel to resolve questions of constitutionality. We lost there, went to the Second Circuit, lost there,
Wow.
and filed our case in the U.S. Supreme Court. Unfortunately, we didn't get to argue our case because a legal aid program from Georgia was just a little ahead of us.
We beat you there.
And they beat us there.
What do you know? What the name of that case is?
That case is Bell versus Burson. And the court decided in the favor of our clients. They said, no, it was really an unconstitutional burden on poor people. And the states had to come up with some other system, which ultimately, of course, I don't know how much this was an effect, but ultimately the resolution for that and other problems was mandatory liability insurance, which in a sense was also a problem for lots of our clients because they couldn't afford that. But those who really needed to drive, that was something that they had to do. But it was a very interesting case, partly because Bruce and I really managed that case. And again, it was still pretty inexperienced. And everybody else thought we were nuts, that was just never going to win, but ultimately it did. So it was a fun case to do.
That sounds
Yeah,
fun.
Pretty, yeah. It would have been really neat if we'd got a chance to argue it in the Supreme Court. But even arguing the Second Circuit was a pretty big deal in those days, and it was that was neat.
Any other particular cases that you remember that were quite memorable for you personally or the organization?
Well, that police case was interesting. I don't remember the details of the case, but I know that a lot of our clients, again, particularly the Puerto Rican community, lots of trouble. I mean, it was probably the racial profiling would be what we would call it today. That just forever a conflict between those clients and the police department. And I remember not quite figuring out exactly how to put a lawsuit together, but there was beginning to be a nationwide organization of legal aid programs with some federal funding at this point, of course. And somebody organized a training on police misconduct litigation. As I recall, it was on the West Coast, and when because that was coming back from that was the first time I met Doug Crockett, who ultimately came back and was the director there, because he was involved in something at Hartford. He was working at the Hartford Neighborhood Legal Services at the time. At any rate, I think it was West Coast, but learned a lot about how to structure these kinds of cases and whatnot. And we did, and got as I recall, a pretty good settlement from the town of the city of Willimantic. Made some changes in the way they practiced with their client, with particularly the Puerto Rican community. It's interesting that there were lots of interesting clients. It was fun to really develop relationships with people that you might not otherwise do, and to learn about how difficult it was to be poor, but how really sort of people managed to survive quite well, and in terms of their own feelings about themselves and good spirits and so on. But I can remember only a couple of clients, and that's probably more about my age than anything. There was one client, a woman who, I can't remember what, I mean, it was a domestic relations. I assume that we had gotten a divorce for her, or we were needing to do that. but I think there was some issues about her children and her custody, and then we got involved. There were some welfare issues, but this woman I remember was a real. She was actually sort of a sad sack, and you know. She would sort of, I mean, she was a nice person, but things just happened to her all the time, and feeling
Sort of bad luck.
yeah, bad luck. I mean, you know, I mean, but again, there was a problems with the divorce, there was a problems with custody or support, but then she had some problems with welfare as well, and it just sort of all these things. I mean, poor. I won't mention her name, but just you know, on and on and on and on, and I got to know her quite well because she continually had problems, you know. But that also talks about we begin to develop some breadth of experience about working with people, and you know, she kept bringing us a new problem that we had to figure out how we could handle it for her. So it was, but she was kind of a sad sack, nice lady, but just you know, the world was
Did the clientele change over time from the earliest years throughout your time there, or the types of cases that you were handling?
Well, sure. I'm not sure that the clients changed, although the clients in rural northeastern Connecticut are different than the clients in an urban center, for instance, and the poverty is different. And over the the sort of almost 40 years that I was involved, clearly the legal problems changed. But also our response to them and what we were able to do changed. You know, as I said, in those early days, we did some federal litigation and other legal aid programs in the state and across the country were doing the same kind of thing, sort of and this somebody suggested that this was the low-hanging fruit. I mean, nobody had been paying attention to due process for poor people. And so there was just lots of abuse of process, and so
We've heard this theme, I think.
Yeah, well, it's
throughout
true.
our
Yeah,
interviews.
exactly. I mean, we were able to say, well, you know, that's just not a fair process, and we were able to go to court and challenge it and force the welfare department, the motor vehicle, whoever it was, to change their process. And that was very exciting and satisfying and helpful for clients. Over a period of time, of course, that in order to make sure that those processes worked, we need to represent people in the hearing processes and those kinds of things. And so the nature of our work did change some because now we had to make sure by representing individuals that the process was working correctly. Interestingly, today, the legal aid programs here in Connecticut, across the country, have instead of assigning staff to represent individuals in a lot of those hearings, there's much more of an emphasis on training the clients to be able to do that themselves. Training the clients, training the systems to be able to handle self-represented people as well. Certainly the court system in Connecticut is really responsive to the self-represented litigant, and that all of that there's a lot of effort to train and teach them and give the clients the skills and tools they need to do that. It's still, in a sense, a more efficient use of staff time because you can help a lot more people with a given amount of staff time than you can if you're providing the representation throughout a case. I mean, that's the whole theory of statewide legal services, which is primarily, it's a telephone advice service for poor people, and most of and I'm sorry, it's a referral as well. I mean, we work with the other legal aid programs in the state, so that if we identify a client who really has a problem that needs representation, they get representation in the system. But an awful lot of clients get advice.
So there's certain thresholds. that you have to-
Threshold, right? But today it's quite possible for lots of people to be able to represent themselves, getting a divorce, challenging custody, support orders. I mean, the family law is where a good deal of the court system's self-represented litigants are, and we can be very helpful in helping people to be able to do that. In the early days, of course, that wasn't possible at all. But so that's changed. A lot of the nature of the litigation has changed, whereas in those early days where we were really making constitutional changes and the facts weren't really an issue, so there weren't needs for long trials. Today, most of the what we call impact litigation involves much more extensive fact development and trials and so on.
Interesting.
You know, I mean, I didn't really have when I was first a young staff attorney. I don't think, but I may have had one trial, was, it was actually I do remember it now, it was an auto accident, I mean, our client, it turns out, really was negligent and hurt somebody else's car. And I don't remember why we had a trial. It was, bench trial, a couple of hours worth of trial. But, that was the closest thing to a real trial that I
Interesting.
did in those days. We did a lot of hearings, certainly in housing, a lot of hearings, and certainly in welfare and that kind of stuff, unemployment. So, there was, I learned how sort of anyway, how to learn how to do an interview and cross-examination and whatnot. But sort of a formal trial, we did very little of that in the early
Interesting.
days. Yeah. The other thing, let me tell you, that was different about that was sort of interesting in my experience was, although most legal aid programs don't do criminal work, New Haven Legal Assistance still does some in Connecticut. But in the late '60s, this is before the current public defender system that the state has. Each court would sort of appoint somebody. They had little money to pay for a lawyer, would be a public defender, but not very much, and they had to do sort of a lot of from the bench assigning. But in Windham County, there was a lawyer who sort of made it was his business to do most of this appointed work by the court, by agreement with the bar and the court. I mean, they're just sort of most people, in most cases where the court was going to appoint a lawyer, and there were not that many, they appointed him. Anyway, but there was some money available, and I don't remember exactly how that came about, some state money to do some essentially public defender work. And Bruce Burwald applied for that, and we got this grant to do criminal work in Talon County, in what was then the circuit court. So these are minor misdemeanor kinds of cases. Anyway, we hired a lawyer to do the work just out of law school, but he had yet to pass the Connecticut bar. And with these grants, you got to spend the money. I mean, you can't wait forever. So anyway, make a long story short, I was the younger attorney between Bruce and myself, so I got the assignment to do this criminal work for 3 or 4 or 5 months. I can't remember how long. And I had taken a criminal law course in law school, but I knew bupkis about the criminal law. I mean,
You're teaching yourself.
well, exactly right. Actually, we had hired Arthur Meisler, was the lawyer's name, and he and I started by going and simply sitting in on circuit court and watching. The prosecutor knew who we were. Interestingly, I had a beard at the time, Arthur had a beard, and the prosecutor referred to us as the Smith brothers. I don't know whether you remember the Smith brothers cough drops, but at any rate, the interesting thing was that the Windham County Bar Association thought we were competing with Dick Kelly,
Right.
the lawyer who had been, sort of his practice was based on this work, and they were not happy with having a legal aid program there anyway. The Windham County Bar was among several bars in Connecticut who really were fighting tooth and nail about having legal aid programs.
I want to get into that.
So at any rate, this was the crowning problem as far as they were concerned, they just gnashed their teeth. So the grant started. Finally got a client, and I don't remember what the person was charged with. Again, it would have been misdemeanor charges. And they called the case, and I stood up with my client. And the prosecutor, who, by the way, really was not a bad guy, I mean, he and a fair man, but he said, "Your Honor, I object to Mr. Janes representing this client." And the judge, who I'm sure knew this was going to come. I mean, this was no secret to anybody. I didn't know he was going to do that. But anyway, Judge Bielik said, "Mr. Janes, are you licensed to practice law in Connecticut?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "Well, then that's good enough for me. Want to go ahead?" But it was, I really admire those who do criminal law, particularly at that level with these kinds of cases. It is a very stressful kind of thing to do, I think. I was very glad when Arthur got the news that he passed the bar and he could take over. And he did very well. He was a wonderful attorney. No.
So let's go back to the private bar. Was there hostility in the beginning where you were and across, the different
Absolutely.
departments in
Yeah,
Connecticut?
it was interesting that the Windham County Bar Association, and again, the Towel and Windham, that refers to the two counties that we covered. We had an office in Rockville and an office in Willimantic, actually, and then one in Danielson for part of the time. But the Windham County Bar was very opposed to the program starting, in spite of the fact that we had lawyers on the board. And the funding for this came from what was called the Office of Economic Opportunity, federal agency, part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. But there had to be some local board, and so we had lawyers on the board, but there was a lot of hostility.
What were their main concerns?
Well, mostly foolish ones. Worried about competition. It was the sort of the unspoken and yet probably the most voiced one. That because they said, well, if somebody really wants a divorce, why they're going to come up with the money to hire us to do the divorce? And it was partially true, but not totally true. I mean, a lot of these people simply didn't get divorces, or whatever it might be. But divorce was the one that was sort of the most obvious, partly because they could see that that's what we were doing a great deal of, because that's what clients understood lawyers did. But somehow that they figured that we were going to steal money. I think that probably those who represented landlords probably figured out that was going to be a problem, because there was a pretty lawless process, and if there was going to be a lawyer on the other side, that was going to make it a much more difficult thing. But I think there was also pushback. Again, Windham County is pretty rural, pretty conservative. The federal government come in telling us how to do these things. We don't like that. I mean, all of those kinds of things. And there was other than that incident with the prosecutor in that criminal law case. I never felt like somebody was taking advantage of or was going to do something different with me as a lawyer on an individual case. And again, and after a while, you get to know the lawyers, and they found out that we were sort of real lawyers, and they were doing, so that it did begin to die down.
Did change.
Philosophically, they were still opposed to it, but on a case-by-case basis, I don't think that anybody intentionally did something to me or my client because I was a legal aid lawyer. Maybe they did, but I didn't know about it. I'll tell you one other story. When I was first hired and first passed the bar, I had a beard. I'd start growing my beard actually the day I graduated from law school.
You've never shaved it?
I've never shaved it since. But in those days, it was very unusual to lawyers to have, because this was the 60s, remember, and hippies had beards, and nobody else, sort of respectable people didn't have beards. In spite of the fact that, in courtrooms all over the place, there were pictures of older lawyers, and judges with beards and button chops and the whole bit. Anyway, so I'm sure I was probably the only lawyer in Windham County with a beard. And I remember the first time I appeared in Superior Court, probably on a divorce case, the judge, Perry Barber was his name, I think was visibly shaken when he realized that I was the lawyer and not the client or not somebody else there. And knowing that, I made sure that whenever I was going to court, that not only did I have a suit and tie on, but I had a white shirt, so that I, clearly, I fit in. I knew I had the uniform on. And to this day, when I am working, a coat and tie is part of it. As I said for a long, and that's not common in legal aid in those days or now. But I've always said when I'm working and I'm worshiping, I'm going to dress like I mean business. So, anyway.
So who are your mentors throughout your entire career, but especially in the beginning?
Well, especially in the beginning, Bruce Burwald really was, in spite of the fact that he was only a couple of years older than I was and didn't have that much more experience. But in spite of the fact that he was a real hotshot and was in your face about a number of things, he really was had real good sense about him, and I learned a lot from him. A little later on, Doug Crockett was in a way. Doug is a brilliant lawyer, and really had a real broad vision about what the law could do for poor people. He was so brilliant that he sometimes had trouble having us mere mortals understand what he was saying or doing and where he was going. But his real grasp of a vision of what you could do was really inspiring to me and a lot of others. Bill Clendenin, who in a couple of months will be president of the Connecticut Bar Association, was another mentor. Bill was working for New Haven Legal Assistance. And they had been in existence, some few years more than we did. And they had created what was called a law reform unit. And Bill and a couple of other lawyers really spent their time working on, what we call impact cases, cases that were going to go beyond the individual client's need. And we worked with Bill on a number of cases, including the financial responsibility case, but several others as well. And he, had been, there again, he probably was a couple years ahead of Bruce in terms of experience, but had done a fair amount of federal litigation at that point, and really taught us a lot. But later, there's been lots of folks that I have over the years that really I have learned a lot from. My friend Marvin Farbman, who actually succeeded me as executive director of Connecticut Legal Services, with whom I worked for many years, is just, a fellow of great wisdom, and with whom I'm still very close friends. And but I learned a lot from Marvin. Not so much about practicing law, although he was a very clever lawyer, but more about life and how to live one's life and how to work with other people. And there's plenty of other people in the Bar Association. Eventually, as you know, I got involved with the Bar Association and was president of the Bar Association in 2006 and 7. And, lots of folks there, lawyers who are real leaders in the bar. Lou Pepe, Fred Urey, Livia Barndolo, folks that I work with who are just amazing individuals and who serve their clients incredibly well, but serve the legal system. Just are remarkable people, and I learned so much from being able to work with them. It was a real privilege, a real honor to know them and to be able to work with them. So, lots of mentors. One doesn't do this alone.
It's very true. We've talked about this a little bit, but how did the funding impact the work that you were able to do in the early days and throughout?
Well, actually, there is, I'm sure that somebody who wanted to take the time could really trace a lot of relationship between the funding and what we were able to do. In those very early years, it was pretty free money, very little restriction, very little limitation. Not a lot of money. It was very little money, but not a lot of control. Then again, eventually, I'm trying to think how to describe it. Eventually, it did begin to change in that there was more sort of specific purpose money, like the money that we got to do the criminal work. And obviously that drives, what you do. I later on, when I became executive director of Connecticut Legal Services, a good deal of my responsibility was to try and find money to support what we're doing. And I always used to say to staff, look, we have this incredible range of things that we could be doing for clients, these needs. We're never going to meet them all. We're never going to be able to address them all. So if somebody's willing to pay us to do this one and not that one, guess what? We're going to do this one, as long as it really is a legitimate client need. And that certainly was my philosophy for a long time. And over the years, I think that's true. The priorities are driven by what you can get money to be able to do. That's a sort of a positive way of looking at how the money influences it. There are negatives as well. In the early days, there was very little sort of political limitation on the money. But one of the reasons that the Federal Legal Services Corporation was formed in 1974 was a recognition by American Bar Association, which was a big supporter, by Congress, that a lot of what we were doing really was political. I mean, we were challenging the establishment in lots and lots of ways. And it was going to be inevitable that at some point somebody's going to say, "What? We're giving them money to do that? Why would?" And so they created the Legal Services Corporation, which was then clearly the principal funding source in the country, as a way of isolating the politics and the money and therefore the work. Had mixed success because the Legal Services Corporation, of course, gets its money from Congress, an appropriation from Congress. The board of directors of the Legal Services Corporation is appointed by the president. Well, guess what? Presidents and Congresses are very political. And so that they did, it was a little indirect, but they clearly had a way of influencing. And the interesting thing is that I became executive director of Connecticut Legal Services in 1980. And actually, I think it was April 1st of 1980. In November 6th or 7th of 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president. Ronald Reagan, as you know, was a very conservative guy, and was the Republican majority at the time was very hostile to lots of the social services kinds of things which had gone up, from in the late 60s and 70s and early and so on, and we're trying to roll that back. And Ronald Reagan had had a bad experience with legal aid when he had been governor of California, so legal services was pretty high on his list of programs to cut. His first budget recommended zero funding for legal aid, essentially to do away with it. Fortunately, Congress didn't agree 100%, although they cut the budget by 25%. And that was most of our budget, and so our budget was cut by nearly 25%. And so that obviously has a lot of impact on what you can do. You got to roll back. I mean, we laid off I don't know how many lawyers and other staff, and that clearly impacts on what you can do. There was at least one experience. This was very early on when what was then New Britain Legal Aid, now part of Connecticut Legal Services, had some. I think it was community development block grant money. Again, federal money that was going into the local localities to make some changes to benefit the lives of the poor. And this probably was the early 70s, but don't quote me on that. At any rate, the municipal agency that was administering those funds said you can't do something, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but they were told if you want our money, you got to stop doing this. And the board of the agency said, no, we can't not do this. We've got obligations to clients, and so we're going to have to turn down your money. And so it clearly the money had real consequences.
So it sort of ebbed and flowed.
And it ebbed and flowed. I mean, in those 40 years where I was involved, there was times of relative plenty and times of incredible lean. When I was executive director of Connecticut Legal Services, again, we started, and one of the first things I really had to do was to figure out how to shrink the staff by, a significant amount. I was also there when the IOLTA money first came in.
And when was that?
That was late 80s, I think 1988 was when it first started, I can't remember. But that was an incredible opportunity because suddenly we had this really great funding source that was grew for a number of years in a pretty exponential way. An opportunity to take the interesting thing is, in terms of being an administrator, that when you lose money or when you gain money is when you really do the best thinking about what it is you're doing and how you're going to do it. When you're losing money, you've got to figure out what's the most important thing and how can we make sure that we do that no matter the fact that we're losing money. But the same thing when this, particularly the IOLTA money came in, a huge explosion. Well, what else is there out there? What's the most important things out there that we haven't addressed? And what can we do and how can we do it with this great new resource? Really challenging, but interesting and exciting time. Mm-hmm. And again, it's been up and down. Those were the major swings, but plenty of other minor swings in my career as an administrator.
So this is a very broad question, but what have you learned from your experiences?
What have I learned?
And what would you like to share for the future?
Two things. That's a better. What would I like to share? Two things. One is that we really do have an incredibly effective. Our legal system is vitally important. Let me put it that our legal system, our judicial system, our system of resolving conflicts is vitally important to society. I can't imagine a civilized society that doesn't have some system of resolving disputes, of challenging authority like ours. It and sort of as a corollary to that, I've learned that, and I'd like to share, I think it's important that we lawyers recognize our role in that. Even in this day and age when there's so much emphasis on self-represented people, which I certainly think is a wonderful thing. There's no reason that in a democratic society, all of the institutions of government, including courts, can't be open to everybody. So I really support that. But there are aspects of it that really only lawyers are going to be able to manage and make sure that it's effective for all parties. And it really is, when it really comes down to it, the role of the lawyer, really, we are peacemakers. We provide an alternative to violence in resolving disputes. And I think that I'm not sure that enough lawyers recognize that. But think about if you didn't have this legal system, if you didn't have lawyers to make sure that it really did work effectively, either it would not be at all democratic. I mean, it probably would not be democratic, and small d. And I'm not sure that I'd want to live in a country that didn't have some element of freedom and opportunity. And so, we lawyers have an incredibly important role to play in that. And so the other thing I want to share is just how privileged I think I've been to be able to do that. When you really think about it, when you reflect back, and it will be, I haven't been a lawyer for 50 years, but I'm closer to 50 than to 40 now as a lawyer, which is an awfully long time. And you think about the awesome responsibility that we lawyers have for our clients. It really think about what we can do to a client if we don't represent that client well. I mean, awesome responsibility, awesome opportunity as well for the clients. But what that is something which when you think about it, say, holy cow, what am I doing? Can I, what's here? But it's also a wonderful privilege to be able to have that responsibility, but also the privilege of relating to the clients. Clients. And I know it's true of the clients that I've served, but I'm sure it's true of any lawyer's clients. They're willing to share with us, their lawyers, the most intimate aspects of their lives, to trust us to hold that and honor that. But just I'm in awe to think that somebody is willing to do that with me. That they trust me enough. Again. Often they don't know me other than I'm a lawyer, but they trust me with their lives and their livelihood, but the intimacy of their lives that they are willing to share with me. It's just amazing experience, and I'm so grateful that I've had the opportunity to do it. And I'm particularly grateful that I've had the opportunity to do that for legal aid clients because clearly, folks who are in the margins. Need it more than anybody else, and I'm it's just so wonderful that we have a system to be able to do that. So
Wonderful. Before we conclude, is there anything else that you'd like to share?
No, I want to thank you. I want to thank Bob
Thank you,
Zweig
Norm.
Bob Zweig from Legal Presentation Solutions for all his support in this project. This has been really, really interesting, and I hope that others will take a look at these videos because, the folks who were involved in these early days, we really were pioneers. A little bit adventuresome, a little bit of chutzpah, a little bit of mistakes, but it was wonderful.
Making huge differences.
I mean, obviously, in many, many ways, we did. And the stories that others tell are very revealing, very interesting, and I commend this to anybody who's interested in what we did. So, thank you.
Thanks, Norm.
Thank you, Bob.